Slain is one of those games that drew my eye almost immediately. I mean, just look at it. It looks lovely, the music is awesome, and mixed with some difficult Castlevania-like gameplay for $12.99, seems to be right up my alley, so this is going to be a massive hit, right? Right? And yet the game has gotten a large negative reception on launch, having a mixed Steam rating as I make this video. So is the story of this game as simple as another game that fails to deliver? Sadly for Slain, the general public seems to be in the right here, although it may not be for all the reasons that have been listed so far. Slain is a more classic take on the side-scrolling action genre, but begins with the awakening of the hero Bathorn. He's a great hero, he needs to liberate a bunch of towers, destroy evil monsters, etc, etc. Look, it's your standard save the world plot here. Granted, it's done in a gothic world, but you've seen the story before, and it's not going to wow you with its writing. In fact, the writing has that broken English element to it, as sentences sometimes don't naturally flow together and feel disjointed. So basically, fight your way through the levels using your sword and magic, and kill the boss at the end of the stage. You've got a basic attack as well as a decapitation attack, which can be used to gain mana back from enemies. The combat is simple here. You'll rely on a few skills such as an aerial attack, and will hopefully stay out of the reach of the hard-hitting enemies that you'll come across. During your trek, you will get new items to use, such as a flame sword and an ice axe, and certain enemies are a lot easier due to their elemental weaknesses, or the strength of the weapon in general. Now, this does add a nice bit of strategy to the game, as you will need every advantage over your opponent in order to get through the level. There are no side items, however, like you'd see in other games of the genre here, so you're completely reliant on your magic and your swordsmanship. And true to the game's name, the game is going to make it difficult at every turn, as you will die repeatedly attempting to cross the slimy swamps to the ancient castles it sets before you. The game has been given a bit of flack for its controls, and when it comes to the keyboard, it's rightfully so. Pressing down on the arrow key doesn't cause Bathorn to move right away. There's a half a second delay that happens. Now this is huge considering the gameplay in question relies on precision and timing, so this game is only playable with a controller in my opinion. Now while the devs say that they're going to fix that, that's a crucial issue on launch, combined with the fact that this game was delayed several times. It shouldn't have launched in this state, especially when you consider the primary market of Steam uses a keyboard. Now playing with an Xbox 360 controller, it is responsive and does complement the action that the game centers around to a certain extent. But if you're expecting something with a high amount of speed and maneuverability, you've got another thing coming. The game is very deliberate in how it goes about its gameplay. You move slowly, but with purpose. Your attack can have a bit of a slow sequence to it, either in the front or back swing depending on the weapon, so it can leave you open to attacks. Now one thing the game was given flack for is that it teaches you nothing. No tutorial or anything, so it doesn't show you the ability to sidestep for example, or how to use your magic attacks. Now while I usually play with all the buttons to figure out what I can do right out of the get-go, I can understand this frustration from people, in particular with the magic attack that it wants you to do at one point and doesn't actually say how to do it. Now I said Slain may be an action side-scroller, but in my opinion, its core essence is memorization and rhythm. Now that may sound strange to you at first, but what this game comes down to is recognizing enemy patterns, exploiting them, and not jumping right into a death trap. In particular spots of the game, like this wolf run for example, you'll have to remember where certain jumps are so that you don't overdo it and run right into a pit. And while it can have those moments of real frustration when you miss a platform by a couple of pixels, it can also have that sense of victory when you finally fight through it. But this is where the game starts to break apart. Look, the levels are long. Now there is a checkpoint system for respawning, but that doesn't apply as a save system. If you exit the game, you're back at the start of a tower, and to be honest, that just seems lacking in today's modern gaming world. Your game is difficult, okay fine, but it's also very unclear when the game is going to save and when it won't at first, and frankly, it doesn't really add anything to the gameplay in the overall picture. I don't like having to redo things over and over and over again when I've mastered a section, and in Slain's case, the difficulty isn't the issue here, it's the nature of the gameplay. Sections really have very little variation in terms of combat and strategy. Like I said before, it's about pattern memorization and execution, and when I've got the pattern down, what you're making me do is repetitive and really unnecessary. Now this seems to be a curse of nostalgia embedded within the game, and yes, I remember the old NES days fondly as well, but we've evolved since then. It also doesn't help that the aesthetics of the game doesn't necessarily help it. Let's make it clear, this game's visual style blows a lot of indie games out of the water. It's unique yet masterfully done, like a piece of artwork. But this is a game, and if the artwork takes away from the gameplay, that's a problem. While the art style is lovely, did you even notice that indicator that I could cut off that creature's head? You probably didn't, right? See, things blend into the environment way too easily in this game, and while sharp eyes will do well, even they may have trouble seeing some of the indicators the game gives. That's part of an overall problem with Slain. I don't feel like everything works in harmony with each other. Like the level design was developed separately from the game design mechanics, and the visuals don't work well with the gameplay design. Now that sounds silly at first, but you need to realize that a game is like a series of gears in a clock. If one gear is slower than the others, well, the whole clock is basically screwed up. The machine creaks, the machine bends, and worst of all, the machine eventually breaks. In addition, Slain does have one particular problem that I haven't seen a lot of discussion about, and it all has to do with level design. Now the game is difficult, and one of the main mechanics that the game relies on is teaching via failure. You rushed into that situation only to get your head chopped off? Learn to slow down. Don't know what that object is? You should know better when there's blood dripping off of it. These are good examples of teaching via a player death, giving a lesson that the player can use going forward. But that mechanic can only go so far without it starting to feel unfair, and that's where Slain definitely crosses the line at times. Where a player is asked to react way too quickly to a situation, or to an unfamiliar situation that will lead to his death almost instantly, and without a lot of lessons to be learned. Let's take for example this section here. At this point, you're first introduced to these hands that will allow you to jump up high to reach new platforms. Now the game introduces them well at first, making it simple to get an extra health item and with practically no danger to it. Then it starts introducing platforms at reasonable heights, making you attempt to get on them with some leeway for failure, but it makes you try it again easily in that case. And then, this sequence happens. This trap comes out of nowhere, and while it's been introduced up to this point, it's in combination with several new elements here. The bigger bird enemies are seen for the first time, so you're naturally drawn to them as they are a new threat. And the ravens that hide the trap then become an element that you draw a connection to the whole common bird thing with the bigger bird enemies. But notice here, this trap. Earlier in the game it did show birds obfuscating that kind of trap in question, but with the addition of several other elements to react to here, there may be only a couple of conclusions to this sequence at first. In short, it's a dick move. See, in games where you have deadly traps, the traps should be obvious, or at least having a player be able to react to them. Now I admit, in this game, I died once or twice by not paying attention, but this one trap in question came down to random chance. If I went left, I was fine. If I went right, death. Difficulty is a tricky thing at times to get right. Making a hard game is fine and all, and I actually somewhat appreciate Slain's approach to methodical yet boring combat. However, that comes with a catch. A game can be difficult, but still fair. It's setting the rules of your universe so the player knows what he's getting into, and making new rules clear so that they can react to it. If you do it too quickly, or not with any indication whatsoever, that's going to cause frustration for the player. And in combination with everything else in this game, it's a game that you don't want to play. The game also has technical issues. Not in terms of performance, that's perfectly fine. No frame rate drops, and it runs at a smooth frame rate of 60 FPS or so. But I'm talking about execution here, like the problems with the keyboard that I mentioned earlier. Note this sequence, and in particular, note when I take damage. See how I take damage after the other character is in a death animation? And that's gonna cause a bit of problem for people. If an enemy's dead, well, it really shouldn't be able to hit me after it's dead. Again, this seems to be tied with the base engine of the game, very similar to the controls issue. But it leads to that unfairness problem, that the rules of the world are unclear, and thus, the player is getting more and more frustrated for no reason. Also, bugs. Sometimes the game has some interesting ones to say the least. And while this has to be upscaled for this video in particular, let me play a specific sequence from the live stream. Because, well, just watch.
Really? Really? Can you do something else?
So, it must have teleported into the lava. That was the first official boss battle of the game, and while I died a couple of times up to that attempt, the fact that it went out like that sort of was a downer. It was hilarious, but it was a downer. Slaying is an aesthetic treat, but it has massive problems all around it. Many of the core problems revolve around the core engine and the core game design, as the boring, repetitive nature of combat is made worse by some bad level design. Old mechanics from games past come up here, and there's a reason why some of them have been cycled out from the developer playbook. And while it's not as bad as some of the Steam reviews would say, it's a very, very limited audience that's going to enjoy it. Those who put aesthetics more important than anything else, have a controller handy, and want a nostalgia trip despite the gameplay feeling old and dated, Slaying could be for you. But in most cases, this game is worth a pass until the major problems with the game are fixed. Thanks for watching. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you want more content like this. In the description below, you'll find the Steam review accompanying this vid, along with social media that you can follow me on, Twitter, Google+, and Facebook groups. And if you want to support the channel, click that Patreon on the left of the screen. And remember, keep on gaming.